Welcome to another edition of the Upper Bowl Perspective, a Utah Jazz podcast giving you an Upper Bowl point of view with courtside quality, joined as always by Kyler and by Landon. And if you haven't noticed, we're recording on another day because the final domino has dropped, signaling the full rebuild for the Utah Jazz, the dominoes that started falling when Quinn Snyder quit, and then later when Rudy Gobert was traded to the Minnesota Timberwolves. Those are pretty good indications we were at least going into some sort of a rebuild. But now with the breaking news that Donovan Mitchell has been traded to the Cleveland Cavaliers, we're all in. We're blowing it all the way up. And just because Kyler has been on this for months, we're going to give him the full credit. Kyler, how about you give us a little bit of a victory lap, and then we can actually go into the different trade details.
Man, I just got to say that I am so we'll talk about Donovan leaving here in a second because I'm not happy about a player of Donovan's caliber leaving, but just I had wanted for so long, before this season even started, just with the way 2 seasons ago ended, I knew that the Jazz didn't have enough to win a championship, nor did we have the assets to get there. Every Jazz fan that I talked to in my life was like, oh, how can we get Harrison Barnes? How can we get Jeremy Grant? And yeah, those would have been nice pieces for this Jazz, but we were never one piece away. We were multiple pieces away, and we didn't have the cap space or the draft assets to get it done. And so I've just been pushing and pushing, fighting against all my friends, saying that no, let's not go get, that win now piece. We do not want to make, what we had as an asset we were kind of dry in terms of future assets. Now, when you look at it, I saw a tweet earlier today that said we now have, between now and 2029, we now only have one less pick than the Oklahoma City Thunder. So we went full Thunder. In our very first episode, when we talked about like our mock off seasons and stuff, I did the mock OKC build and the Jazz went through with it. So who knows? We had like 50, 60 views on that. Maybe one of them was someone making decisions in the Jazz front office. Probably not, but still, just like what I've been pushing for so long coming to fruition. It just feels great because, like I said, I've been fighting with friends and family for so long that this is what the Jazz needed to do, and they did it.
Well, Kyler, congratulations on your victory lap. I'm glad you got to get that out of your system. We've been talking about this for at least the past 6 months, so I'm glad that it finally came to fruition the way that you wanted. One thing that is super, super clear is that the Jazz are going completely full rebuild. We do not want to win games the next couple of years as we start to develop young players and accumulate draft capital. Now the only question that remains is, do the Jazz have enough in terms of young players that they've received through these most recent trades and through their draft capital to potentially build a title contender maybe by the end of the decade? So let's go through the trade details first, and then we'll break down each of these assets one by one to see how is this going to work forward in terms of the Jazz building what will hopefully be a title contending team, even better than we've had the last couple of years in Utah. So the full trade details: Donovan Mitchell gets traded to the Cleveland Cavaliers in exchange for Colin Sexton, Lauri Markkanen, Ochai Agbaji, who was the 14th overall pick in this year's draft for those who aren't massive draft heads like we are. They also got 3 unprotected first-round picks in 2025, 2027, and 2029, and the opportunity to pick swap in 2026 and 2028. So before we go into the actual details, Landon, when you heard of this trade, because for weeks it was rumored that the Knicks and the Jazz were getting closer together, then they were falling farther apart, but it always seemed like the Knicks were there on the table as the team that was likely to land Donovan Mitchell. When you saw this trade with those 3 players and those picks, what was your initial thought? Do you think it was worth it? Think it wasn't?
My initial thought was this was a haul. This was, I think, a pretty fair trade for Donovan Mitchell. I thought we got back 3 quality players. I'm particularly excited for Colin Sexton. Before he got injured, season 2 ago, he was averaging over 20 points a game. So I think he could definitely be like quality starting guard. He might be a guard of the future. So glad we got a guy like him on the team. The only downside of this is I think Cleveland is going to be really good. I think they're going to be good for a long time now. They've got maybe the best young core in basketball right now. I feel like all their main players are borderline all-stars, and they're all under 25 or 26. It's right there, but he's the oldest of that group. And so I think they're going to be good. That makes me concerned about like what we're going to be able to get out of those draft picks if we do choose to keep them. But overall, it was a good deal. The only other interesting thing about this came out after this that the Knicks had reportedly made an offer that was similar to this with 3 players. I think also 300 protected draft picks. Jazz denied. Now, I don't know if that's true. I've heard that could just be the Knicks, leaking something to save face. But if that was an offer, I almost like that one better because I don't think the Knicks would be as good as Cleveland with Donovan. So that's my thought. I mean, I'm happy about it. I think he was a good all this year.
Yeah, it was definitely an interesting pick. Landon, I think you might need to move your mic just a little bit closer to your mouth. You're tailoring off just a little bit there at the end of sentences. But everything that I've read, everything that I've listened to the past 24 hours since the trade, the only real criticism I've heard from the Jazz is that now you have Darius Garland, Donovan Mitchell, Evan Mobley, and Jarrett Allen all on the same team. Donovan Mitchell's the oldest. You have Mobley, who's coming into a second year, who has the potential to be a perennial all-star and potentially like a top 100 player in the league when it's all said and done. He could be that good defensively. Jarrett Allen was an all-star center last year. You have Darius Garland, who really took over as a really strong guard in the league, who absolutely has all-star potential. So it's hard to imagine that those picks in 25 and 27, potentially maybe even 29, are going to be that great as long as Cleveland's able to keep that core together. So the picks, we will see how those end up in the future. Obviously, when you're in a rebuilding phase, the more picks you have, the more flexibility you have in terms of trades and assets going forward. But I think the important aspect here is that the Jazz got 3 players who all project to be, if not starting caliber players in the future, at least rotation players who could potentially play in a smaller playoff rotation down the road. So we'll go through those 3 one by one in terms of order of maybe value in the market right now. First is Colin Sexton. Now, he was out a lot of the season last year with an injury, but in the sign and trade with the Jazz, he came over 4 years, $72 million, which, just so you know, is the exact same deal we gave Bogey when he came to the Jazz. He's 38% for his career from 3. He's a small guard. He's only 6'1", but his last full season, which was 2 seasons ago before his injury, he averaged 24 points, 4 assists, and 3 rebounds on a really, really bad Cavs team. He was kind of a good stats, bad team kind of guy, which honestly I think is something that the Jazz are going to want as they move into this rebuilding stage. Kyler, the fact that Colin Sexton was supposedly the best asset in a Donovan Mitchell trade, is he a player that excites you, or I guess how are you feeling about him?
I would disagree that he was the best asset in the Donovan Mitchell trade, but in terms of just the player that he is, he's basically a poverty Donovan Mitchell, if you kind of want to put it that way. He's a guy who nobody's gonna, applaud him for his playmaking skills, but he can score on all 3 levels. He's definitely a very intense guy. Like, he'll go through spouts where he's trying really hard defensively, but like you said, he's undersized, so there's only so much you can do there. But like effort defensively, even sporadic, is going to be better than what Donovan Mitchell showed us last year. So I guess maybe on that end, maybe just as good. It's hard to be worse, but that's just a guy that can maybe give you a better glimpse of what Will Hardy's offense was. Because like I've stated in previous pods, I was worried if in these trades we didn't have anybody that really had any creation ability, how would we really be able to fairly judge, Will Hardy's system? So we got a guy that at the very least can break down a defense, get into the lane. He's not, like I said, he's not a very good passer, but at least in terms of just somebody who can actually create space on his own, we have that, and it will give us a better viewpoint of kind of Will Hardy's system. And again, he's also only 23. So there's plenty of time to develop the player that he is right now. It kind of seems like that's going to be the player that he's going to be, but there is obviously time for him to become a more well-balanced player and maybe be more of a point guard, because right now he's a worse passer than Donovan. He's not a point guard.
Yeah. A lot of the biggest issues that have surrounded Colin Sexton into why he was always going to be an awkward fit with the Cleveland Cavaliers is that he plays like a score-first point guard, which is honestly very similar to how Darius Garland plays, although Garland is obviously a much better passer than Sexton. But we know he can score. He's proven that he can score. We know he can shoot. He's proven that he can shoot. It's just going to be, will he be able to develop in those other areas of the game where he can become a better facilitator, where he can maybe get more guys involved, run the offense a little bit more efficiently, hopefully play a little bit better defense. He's a really small dude, so there may be a cap on how much of a defensive impact he can make, but he is still only 23 years old, which means that he should be coming into his prime here in the next 4 years or so. So a lot of it will depend on, over these next 4 seasons, is he a guy who can actually help a team develop and help a team eventually win games, which 4 years, $72 million, I think that's a really good price for Sexton, even though he's just coming off the injury. But I think he's still someone who can be a valuable piece, or even if the Jazz don't want him long term, a lot of teams could use a guy like Sexton, even coming off the bench, to score a bunch of points, just kind of be that spark plug guy. Landon, are you excited to see him in a Jazz uniform? Because he's definitely going to be starting for the Jazz.
I'm excited. I'm excited to see the way that he develops. He is still young. I thought he showed a lot of promise early in his career with Cleveland. Like you said, he averaged 8% shooting. So if he can pick up where he left off there, I think that's a great pickup for the Jazz. Good quality point guards are something that's always going to be a need. Not always the easiest thing to get. So if we can get that out of this whole package, I think that's great. I agree that he might be a little limited defensively because of his size. He's definitely more athletic than Conley is right now. So I think he'd be an upgrade defensively over Conley at the point. Switchability is still an issue. We'd have to, find a way to counter that. With all the young athletic wings that we now have, that might not be as much of an issue as it would have been before. So I think it's good. I think it's exciting. I kind of hope it's part of the Jazz's long term. I think he's a really exciting player to watch.
I have a question though, just because J. Bobby said something that I disagreed with, saying that Sexton would arguably be the biggest asset in return. If you had to rank, let me see, we got eight assets, I guess. Two swaps, 3 picks, and 3 players. How would you rank them in terms of, at least just give us the top 3 assets that you think are in that deal?
Top 3 assets. I actually don't think that Sexton's the best asset that we have. We'll probably talk about it here pretty soon, but I thought that Okay Abdali, hopefully I said his name right. He was, lottery pick in this draft. He's got a great shot. 6'5", 6'6", got that perfect NBA length.
Yeah.
He might have slightly higher ceiling than Colin Sexton. So I think he's probably the best asset. I would put Colin Sexton next, though. And then maybe the most recent now, not 2025.
I mean, I was debating, to answer your question, Kyler, between Agbaji and Sexton as being the best asset, because at least with Agbaji, he's bigger. He showed that he's a great shooter in Kansas. He shot almost 41% last year while he was playing for the Jayhawks, best player on their team, which is one of the best teams in college basketball. And I debated a lot on which one of those I considered the best asset, just internally in my head. Out of all of the guys who went in the first round this year, I was probably lower on Agbaji than a lot of people. For me, seeing guys who come into the NBA super late, because he's 22 years old, right? He was one of the oldest people picked in the draft at all. And those guys always make me worried, just as I've seen the last couple of years, that it's really hard to see sometimes these guys who do get drafted a little bit older, that maybe their draft stock is maybe inflated a little bit on their performance because they're 22-year-olds playing against a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds who've had 4 years of college experience. So I think a lot of times their performance is a bit overinflated compared to their actual skill level at the college level. I like the fact that we have him because I do think he has a higher ceiling than Colin Sexton. I think that Colin Sexton has just proven that he can be a 3-level scorer in the NBA, and he's still really young. He's only a year older than Agbaji, but he already has 3 or 4 seasons in the NBA under his belt. So I think that Colin Sexton, even though he doesn't have maybe the same ceiling as Ochai Agbaji might have, I think he's definitely got a higher floor, just because at bare minimum, we know that he can score a lot of points and that he can shoot, which is always going to be valuable in the league. But I would kind of have them as a 1A, 1B, and then maybe 1C would be maybe the 2029 pick, because that's most likely when the Cavs are going to give us that best pick. But even as much as I love Lauri Markkanen, I do not have him in that first tier of assets. So you're welcome.
Interesting. I think the 2029 pick is easily the most desirable asset here. Obviously, nothing's guaranteed with it, and you look at these Cavs, and like you said, a lot of them are very young, and a lot of them are under contract for a very long time. But let's just think back to literally last year when the Jazz gave up a first-round pick to get off of Derek Favors, which I maintain it was a horrible move, but that was a pick that was just 3 years in the future from a team that, at least in their eyes, like I said, I was already hoping they would tear it apart, but in their eyes, they were going to be a core that, like, Donovan just signed a new contract, Rudy just signed a new contract, right? For a small market team, it is amazing how fast things can fall apart. And so just, is there a chance? Because the only guy that is guaranteed to still be on contract, like at least the possibility, is Evan Mobley. Darius Garland's going to be an unrestricted free agent. Allen's going to be an unrestricted free agent. Donovan's going to be an unrestricted free agent. And Mobley, if he signs a deal with a player option, can also be an unrestricted free agent all before that 2029 draft. And so when you're a small team like Cleveland, that's all of a sudden where you can get a really high draft pick. So I think that's number one. Obviously, nothing's guaranteed with it, but just the possibility of that pick. Even something like 2027, even though those contracts will last through then, again, Rudy and Donovan still had a lot of time left on the Jazz, and they kind of, or at least in Donovan's case, forced himself out. Yeah. And then I would put Ochai Agbaji as number two, just because I think his role is more limited. We'll talk about him later, I'm sure, but awesome 3-and-D guy that I think can excel in that role, where I feel like Colin Sexton, in terms of scoring guards, he's kind of just average in his role. It's a very important role on a team, but I don't think he's a special talent in his role, where I feel like Ochai Agbaji could be like a very positively impactful 3-and-D wing.
Well, let's maybe shift gears a little bit, because we've talked about Agbaji a lot, but we haven't actually dove into him too much. He was taken with the 14th overall pick this year. As was mentioned a few minutes ago, he shot almost 41% from three this last season with the Jayhawks. He was by far their best player. Just pulling up his stats here. He is 22. Last year he scored 15 points a game. And for his career in college, he was 38% from three. So it wasn't like last year was necessarily a fluky season where he shot almost 41%. He's 6'5", so he's a lot bigger. He's listed as a shooting guard, but in how switchable the NBA is today, he could probably play the three as well.
So
and now it's just, what is he going to be? I mean, as I already mentioned, I'm almost always a little bit more down on guys who enter the draft at an older age. And seeing as he is 22 after playing 4 years in college, I don't love him as much just because of that pedigree. So I'm going to let you guys convince me. Why should I be more excited about Agbaji than maybe I am? Because I think he could be a decent rotation player, solid 3-and-D wing, but I have a harder time seeing that ceiling where he could be like a really, really solid player on a good team.
Okay. He's a guy that I wasn't as high on to take him at 14. I definitely thought he was a first-round guy, just not a lottery guy. But here's my argument for Agbaji. You say you don't like maybe measuring production as much for older guys because it's 22-year-olds playing against teenagers. That holds a lot of value. It does, if the way they win is by actually bullying the 19-year-olds. This guy doesn't win that way. He wins by shooting the three. Shooting the three is the same when you're 19 years old as it is when you're 22 years old. He wins off the ball. He doesn't rely on being more physically dominant than his defender to get the basket. He's a very good cutter. He's an athlete. He's a lob finisher. So when you think of a guy, I'm not saying he's exactly this player because I do think there's some differences. If in this last Jazz iteration, just think of a Royce O'Neal, where a lot of what he was asked to do was off ball, maybe in some transition, hitting a lot of just catch and shoot threes. I think he can do all that. Royce O'Neal was also a decent cutter. He wasn't anything special. I think Ochai Agbaji is at least as good as him as a cutter, and definitely more athletic in terms of a guy that you can actually just throw it to him above the rim and he can get it. very much a 3-and-D guy, maybe a little bit more 3 than D right now. Because on defense, that's where you get into the fact that maybe you're stronger and you're older, so maybe you can impose your will a little bit more on that end. So it might be a little bit more of a transition because he's no longer stronger than his opponent on defense. But athlete and doesn't really require any sort of winning with strength as we lose Landon on offense. So I think the offense translates, and he's shown multiple years of production from 3. And so I think you can be fairly confident that at the very least, he's an off the bench shooter from day one. And I honestly think, like I said, he can be a very positively impactful 3-and-D guy, kind of like when Royce was viewed at his high end with the Jazz. Like everyone's like, yeah, that guy's good. Obviously, maybe his reputation tailed off just because at the end of the day, he was a 6'4" guy that had some strength, and that kind of limits you and who you can guard when you're kind of the only positive defender outside of Rudy on the team. But that's what I view Ochai Agbaji as, a very safe bet to be a 3-and-D wing, at least the 3 part.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope he has that kind of impact. I'm absolutely rooting for it. It's just, even as I look at some of these guys the past couple drafts, and
Like
Landon's
Desmond
coming
Bane,
back.
you mean?
Dude,
Desmond
you know
Bane
how much I loved Desmond Bane.
Yeah, which is weird because in terms of productivity, being a late person, the profile of what he's going to be in the NBA, very, very similar. And that's probably why he went higher than a lot of projections, is because you saw the success of a Desmond Bane. They are remarkably similar prospects. In fact, Ochai Agbaji projects as even more athletic than Bane. Bane's just more rocked up. He's more of like the Royce, and Agbaji's more of like a 2-3 defender rather than like a 3-4 defender.
Yeah, but then for every, I don't know, because I love Bane. I would love to see Agbaji become a Bane. I'm still not 100% convinced it's going to happen yet, just because, I mean, I don't think Chris Duarte, who is another older draft pick, I don't think he's been as good as maybe I was hoping.
Like prospect, though.
Which I mean, like, granted, he's a very different prospect and a different player, but I think that more often than not, the older guys don't tend to pan out. I think if somebody is going to pan out, I think you make the good argument that an older shooter has a much better chance of being impactful in the NBA than an older guy who relies on his physicality. So I think that is definitely going for Agbaji. I'm still
Chris Duarte did.
Yeah. So I'm hoping that he gets there. We will see if it happens. I'm definitely rooting for it, but it'll be fun to see what he looks like in the lineup, because he's definitely going to get a lot of minutes this year as the 14th pick in the draft. And finally, the last guy, one of the guys I was so high on when he was coming into the NBA out of the draft, which was the third player the Jazz got in the steal, Lauri Markkanen, 25 years old, 7-foot forward. He's known as a 3-point shooter. He does not play like a big at all, despite being 7 foot. And for his career, he shot close to 37% from 3, with 2 years ago shooting over 40% from 3. Career averages, you can get like 15.7 rebounds and an assist a game out of him. Not anything special, but he has a big body. He can stretch the floor. And hopefully that with the combination of his size and length, he projects to be a good defender in a system that Will Hardy will hopefully be putting together, although that is definitely a big question mark.
Projects to be is a nice way to put it.
It is a nice way to put it, but I'm hopeful because I still believe in Lauri Markkanen. I still have all of my Lauri Markkanen stock. Landon, welcome back. It looks like you went into another room with better Wi-Fi, so we welcome you back to the show. Can you hear us?
Sure can.
All right. We can. What kind of a role do you see Markkanen playing on the Jazz this season? Do you think he's going to be starting at like the power forward position, assuming that we trade Bogey, or do you think that he's going to be coming off the bench?
I think in the short term, he's going to be a starter. I think in this kind of interim period that we're in right now, we don't really know who's going to be on the team long term and who isn't. I think I could see him starting and playing a lot of minutes. I don't know if he's like a long-term starting forward, though. I'd love to keep him long-term. I'd love to see if we can get him on a good deal. But I think ultimately I do see him as kind of a 6-man type of player. One of the top guys off the bench to kind of come out. Or someone that you kind of fit in when you need to against certain matchups. He's a great floor spacer. I think he's someone that you could really throw out when your traditional big, like Walker Kessler, whoever you have there, isn't quite doing it. So I think he's a versatile piece. He's definitely going to have, role in a lot of minutes, but I don't know if I want him to be a long-term starter.
Kyler, you make fun of me a lot for me loving my European stretch bigs. So here's the opportunity.
Yeah, how many of those have become like really great players? I don't want to like crap on him too much because I don't think any of what's been said is untrue. Just not a positive defender at the big position. That's really important to me. I don't think he has the lateral quickness to play a ton of 4. You can definitely play him in spots depending on who's lining up on the other team, of course. But definitely not like if the other team's running a little bit small, you don't want him at the 4. He's just going to get cooked left or right and all around. So a shooter with size, and has always just kind of felt like he's come up short. And maybe when he feels like he's might be reaching that next level, has been hit with injuries. He does have not like a horrible injury history, but it's definitely not great either. So more of just a shot in the dark. If he hits, it's kind of just like an add-in to me. I would rank him out of the 8 assets we got, probably like 7th. So I'm not really too enthused about him, but he'll play.
I mean, when I heard we were getting Lauri Markkanen, after getting excited just because I've always loved him more than the average person, was I immediately thought about what the Celtics did this offseason, right? Where they didn't have a good enough bench when it came to playing in the finals against the Warriors. And their lack of depth when they really only had 5 guys they could play in the finals really hurt them in those minutes where they had to bring off some of those wings and forwards to play some of those few minutes a game, and they ended up losing the final. So what did they do this offseason, right? They got a guy like Danilo Gallinari who can come in, who can play solid rotational minutes, score some points. Even though they're maybe not an amazing defender, they're not going to be like a massive liability just because of their size and because they are a veteran. And, you know, it's a good person to have on a team. And that was kind of what I thought. At bare minimum, I think that's what Lauri Markkanen is for us, right?
At bare minimum, interesting. I think Danilo Gallinari is definitely way better than Markkanen, but that's just me.
I think he's better now, but like we'll see where Markkanen gets. But I think that on a Jazz team that's not nearly as good as the Celtics, he could play a similar role for a much worse team. Where worst case scenario, he's one of our guys off the bench who we can trust to play X amount of minutes, not going to make a lot of mistakes, probably going to shoot some threes. He'll be a fun player to watch. And then if he can develop into more than that, he can be a better defender. If he can shoot a little bit higher, because he's had a couple seasons where he shot over 40%, then he's had some seasons where he shot like 34. So if we can get the higher end of that shooting, if we can get somebody who maybe adds more versatility into the roster, even if he's coming off the bench playing 18, 20 minutes a game, I still think he's a valuable player to have for a young team. And he's under contract for the next few seasons. So it also gives us another trade piece if we're trying to go after somebody else. And because of his contract, I think he's getting paid $16 million a year. He's really easy to throw into other trades if we need to down the road. So I'm hoping that Markkanen becomes a guy I was hoping he would be coming out of the draft. I don't know if he'll ever be that guy, but I think bare minimum, he's still a valuable rotation guy to have on the Jazz. And I'm glad that we got him. I'll probably be buying a Markkanen jersey just because I want one.
I'm sure you will.
Yeah. So now let's talk a little bit more about the picks, which you've talked about a little bit. We got the picks 25, 27, and 29, which with the Timberwolves, we got picks in 23, 25, 27, and 29. We have a lot of picks for the 25, 27, and 29 years. How likely do you think it is that any of these draft picks actually turn out to be really good before that 2029 season? Because the Timberwolves are probably going to be a playoff team for at least the next few years. Same with the Cavaliers until there's the possibility that the core breaks up, that may stay together. We can't read the future. But it seems like a lot of these draft picks that we've accumulated have a chance at being not super great long-term. And the easiest way to really rebuild a team to become a franchise that is a consistent title contender is to draft somebody like a Steph, like a Giannis, one of those guys that instantly takes you into that next caliber tier. What do you think is the most likely path for the Jazz to actually get one of those players? Because as I look at our draft stock for the next few years, including what we're getting from Cleveland, it looks like we may not be getting super high draft picks potentially until 27 or 29.
Well, I mean, the idea of a rebuilding team is that the most valuable asset is your own draft pick. Like, let's be honest. Those are going to be the highest picks, at least for the next few years, until we find at least kind of leader. You got the guy that you're, whether or not he should be a one, is your one, and then also some solid role pieces around him, which isn't going to happen after the 2023 NBA draft. So in the near future, at the bare minimum, it's going to be our own picks that is getting the majority of the hard work done. And those other picks are picking the Agbajis and picking the please no more, but the Walker Kesslers and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I feel like at least in these early years, those aren't really meant to be the number one thing. It's going to be our own picks. And then in the future, like let's say by 2025, we've got a lot of guys. All of a sudden, we have all these picks all the way through 2029 that we can trade for another guy that can be maybe the second best player next to whoever we drafted or whatever it is. So it really, like, this whole strategy definitely depends on you getting good draft picks. So
Yeah, that's probably honestly my biggest concern out of this whole deal. Let me put it this way. Our alma mater, Utah State, is playing Alabama this weekend. The spread on that game
bless us.
is 41.5 points. I have more faith that Utah State can beat Alabama than I do that these draft picks are going to give us an MVP candidate. I think Cleveland's going to be that good going forward. I agree that I think it's probably going to be our own picks that are going to do a lot of the heavy lifting as far as getting like the real, good all-star level players. So I kind of hope that we can kind of package some of these picks that we've acquired with some players, either get ourselves another really, really good player or get ourselves into better draft position than what we're currently in. Because I just don't think between Minnesota's picks and Cleveland's picks that we're going to get anything for them if we just keep them as they are.
here's my one kind of, if you want to be optimistic, again, I agree. I think the chances of them being super high is fairly low, but we're talking about 7 years in the future for two small market teams. Minnesota and Cleveland are two of the least attractive destinations for A, to sign new people, and B, to even retain the people that you have. Like, if there's a down year, if the second best player all of a sudden doesn't like the first best player, I don't know, have we seen that story unravel before? Yes, we have. It's not out of the question that within maybe even the next 3 years that there's a lot of malcontent on those rosters, let alone 7 years into the future. And so we're talking about how much the NBA has changed. Let's look at the NBA in 2015. What was the most promising young core in 2015? What happened to them? You know what I mean? So it's saying right now that the core of the Cavs is going to stay together through 2029 is a pretty big reach, in my opinion.
It'll definitely be interesting to see what happens with these picks, with these players. But regardless of what happened with those picks down the road, I am excited because now that I have Colin Sexton, Ochai Agbaji, and Lauri Markkanen in Utah Jazz uniforms next year, that's definitely going to make me have more fun watching the Jazz play next season, to see some more guys who are young and to see how they develop and see if they're going to be part of our core going forward. We've done about 30 minutes on the Donovan trade, so we'll just wrap this segment up really quick before we go into segment 2. But let's all give it a grade. We like giving grades. We have fun giving grades. What letter grade would you give the trade from a Utah Jazz perspective?
From a Utah Jazz perspective, I would probably give it A-. I love the players we got back for them. Picks are always great. I just think that there was maybe slight room for a better pick there, or a better return somewhere out there, slightly, but still good.
I mean, that's always a possibility. I mean, I feel like the Jazz gave every team plenty of opportunity to submit the best offer. And if I know anything about Danny Ainge, he just took the best offer. He just didn't say, hey, Donovan, you like New York? I want to accept these terrible protected picks rather than these Cleveland picks, So I don't love it because, like I said, even though I think it's far-fetched to think that the core will stay together 7 years into the future, the Cavs, in terms of just the age and the core of their team, looks really, really good. And I don't love I don't love any of the 3 players we got back either. I like Ogbaji. I don't love him. So if I was just doing it based off that, I'd only give it like a B, maybe B minus. But the fact that all the Knicks fans have been crying on Twitter over the last couple of days puts up to an A plus just in that alone.
And I would have given it a B plus for the draft picks, but I think the slew of players we got is solid. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens there, but it'll definitely be making for a fun Jazz season. And just before we forget, because we forgot to do this with Rudy Gobert, from the Upper Bowl perspective, huge shout out, all the love to our guy Donovan Mitchell. Together, the 3 of us have watched literally hundreds of Jazz games together with Donovan Mitchell in a Jazz uniform. And from all the dunks to the threes to the 57-point playoff performance to just all the amazing memories that you've given us over the past 5 years, we are excited for you. We hope you do the best in Cleveland. We're excited to see you continue to excel, and we've loved having you on the Jazz. We wish you the best moving forward. And for the Jazz, we're excited to see what we can make of our future going forward and be one of those next, hopefully, bright future young teams in the league. We will be back in just a moment with segment 2, where we're going to be talking about another trade, and not quite as blockbuster as Donovan Mitchell, but we will be breaking down the Patrick Beverley trade, where we got Talen Horton-Tucker and Stanley Johnson. So we'll be back in just a moment with all of that info.
Peace.
Welcome back to the second segment of this edition of the Upper Bowl Perspective. In segment 1, we talked about the Donovan Mitchell trade and all the assets we received therein. And now we're talking about a trade that happened about a week ago, which even though it was not nearly as impactful to the Jazz offseason as the Donovan Mitchell trade, it maybe made us even a little bit happier because we will never have to see Patrick Beverley in a Utah Jazz uniform, even if it is the highlighter yellow uniform. He was traded to the Los Angeles Lakers in exchange for Talen Horton-Tucker and Stanley Johnson. And it's insane to think that in just a year's time, Talen Horton-Tucker can go from being this asset that LA is supposedly very apprehensive of putting in a Kyle Lowry trade to now being the centerpiece of a Patrick Beverley trade. Kyler, I know you were excited to get rid of Patrick Beverley. That's a huge win for the Jazz and for our fan base. Do you think that the combination we got of Talen Horton-Tucker and Stanley Johnson was a good return and one that the Jazz fans can be happy with from a player?
I'd have taken a bag of Doritos, dude. Mostly just because now there's a 0% chance that calling him a piece of crap human being will ever come back to haunt me because he's not on the Jazz. But also just like we traded a guard for a wing, which when we talked about kind of the roster construction of the Jazz in previous episodes, we needed less guards and more wings. And so not only just the fact that I'm not a Patrick Beverley fan myself, just that shifting of roster construction towards the direction we needed to be was a big plus. In terms of just Talen Horton-Tucker, excuse me. Other than the fact that autocorrect tries to screw me over every time I try to type his name in a text, he's a very polarizing player. He's definitely shown flashes of being really good. He's another guy who's built really solidly. The plus wingspan, I think it's like +6 or something. He's got a crazy plus wingspan compared to his height. Showed flashes, but when you look at his lowlights tape, like obviously Russell Westbrook was the king of lowlights on the Lakers in the entire NBA, but like Talen Horton-Tucker got himself a medal, in that Olympic race too. So he throws up some ugly, ugly shots. My favorite part about this, because I don't really love Talen Horton-Tucker, is I want a ton of minutes with Colin Sexton, Jordan Clarkson, and Talen Horton-Tucker all on the court because nobody knows how to play off ball. They're all the same player. Everybody's going to be frustrated that they're not getting the ball enough from the other one. And since the Jazz aren't going to be fun to watch from a winning perspective, let's at least make it entertaining. And I think that could be very entertaining.
Entertaining in the cringy type of way. Like, it's like almost when you watch one of those movies like a Dumb and Dumber or a Nacho Libre, where you watch the game or you watch the movie to enjoy those cringy but kind of funny moments. I feel like that would be the entirety of the Jazz season if we're playing all 3 of those players big minutes, especially together.
I mean, if entertainment is what you're looking for, though, that might be the only way we're going to get it this season, if I'm being quite honest.
I mean, we will definitely see. But for those of you who are more Jazz fans than you are NBA fans, let's just give you a quick kind of rundown. Talen Horton-Tucker, who he is. He's 21 years old. He's 6'4" with a 7'1" wingspan, which is +9, which is pretty dang
+9.
insane.
I wanted to stay conservative with my +6.
But yeah, I mean, like the dude is just super long, 230 pounds, and he plays as a wing. He was drafted 46th overall in 2019, got his contract extension last offseason, 3 years, $30 million, 10 a year. That'll expire in 2024. And he played 60 games for the Lakers last season, where he averaged 10 points, 3.2 rebounds, 2.7 assists, and a steal. But he did that on very, very low efficiency, only shooting 27% from three and 41% from the field. So he's kind of one of those guys where you're like, oh, he's on a decent contract. He's still young. He's shown flashes of being able to score. His stat line isn't terrible. And like that looks okay. But then you look at his efficiency and you look at some of his tape from last year and you're like, should this guy even be in the league when you look at him playing some games? Because he's just that absolutely terrible when you see him play. Landon, I know that we had a little bit of a conversation the other night about Talen Horton-Tucker, but do you think that he's going to be a rotation guy for the Jazz? Do you think it was just like Patrick Beverley fire sale, we don't care? I mean, just do you think he's actually going to get minutes even on a Jazz roster that isn't great?
I think the way the Jazz are now, everyone's going to get kind of an opportunity to show like what they have to offer. If you're asking if I think that like in the long term he's going to be a good rotation player, I think the answer is no. I think he's been in the league long enough. I think we see what he can do. We know what he's about. He's continually lost minutes with the Lakers over the time that he's been there. I don't have confidence that his efficiency is going to go up. He's someone that, you know, can maybe be like your 10th man or whatever. Someone that you keep and then maybe throw out in a game when you're desperate, maybe throw out in the playoff series you're losing, see what he can do. But I'm not a big fan of what he can do. I do love the fact that he is kind of a bigger built long dude. He does bring that much needed defensive versatility, but I don't think that like what he can do on offense. Well, I don't think his defense makes up for like his lack of efficiency or confidence on the offensive end of the ball. But I think the real question we need to ask ourselves here is when are the Jazz going to retire Patrick Beverley's jersey after his prolific Utah Jazz career?
I'd guess the same night as Derrick Rose's, if I'm being honest with you.
Yeah.
I mean, but like at least Derrick Rose had a 50-point game. Sure, it was against the Jazz after they waived him, but at least he did something for us.
Who knows? Pat Beverley could have a really hard technical foul on us. That's probably the most likely thing that he'll do against us. But
he may end his career with the most technical fouls. He may surpass Dennis Rodman in most technical fouls for a career. You never know. It could happen. But just saying, if Patrick Beverley's number ever did get retired, we'd have to bring our boy Brock to that game and just watch him absolutely dissolve into rage throughout that entire experience. But for me, I was trying to evaluate what could the Jazz potentially get for Patrick Beverley. I've been kind of doing this with all of their assets and was doing it after the Rudy Gobert trade. And I don't know if we could have gotten much more than somebody like a Talen Horton-Tucker. I mean, he's shown flashes, which makes him valuable at least somewhat. He's played a lot of minutes. And even though he's been in the NBA for 3 seasons, he's still younger than Keegan Murray, who was drafted 4th overall this year by the Sacramento Kings. I don't think any of us are bullish on him becoming like a really good player, but is there a possibility that he could be like the type of guy eventually who, because of his defensive versatility, maybe if he gets his shot a little bit better, could eventually be a guy who breaks an 8-man rotation? Or do you think that's not even possible?
I think it's certainly possible, but I think even more than his ability, his mindset needs to change. Like, he needs to realize that he's not the best shot creator on the floor pretty much any time he's on the floor, and that's what he plays like. I think it's the NBA has way too many people who like to take the ball and do their thing with it and try to score. We have 3 of those players on the Jazz, like I said, who I want to see them all play together, but it's not like it's a valuable skill set if you can do it with high efficiency, but he doesn't do it with high efficiency. And so it's just kind of, he needs to learn to contribute in other ways, I think, for him to be an actual positive impact.
Yeah, I think he's the kind of guy that you want on your roster in the playoffs, just as someone who kind of adds, another dimension to your game, someone who can kind of do a few different things and can maybe help you, win some playoff games just based off of the matchups you're able to create. But that doesn't necessarily mean I think that he's someone who would get minutes in the regular season, at least for a long sustained period of time. But yeah, that's just kind of how I feel about him.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the knocks on Talen Horton-Tucker is that he hasn't embraced the role that he needs to play in the NBA. There are star players, then there are role players. The vast majority of the league fits in that role player category where you have to find your role, be good at that role if you want to be valuable to a team. Talen Horton-Tucker has been playing like the primary shot creator, number one scoring option when he's been playing for the Lakers, especially when LeBron James hasn't been on the court with him. And he's not that type of guy. What do you consider to be maybe the ideal role for a guy like Talen Horton-Tucker in terms of even what player in today's modern NBA do we think he should be modeling his game and his impact off of? Because it's definitely not being a number one scoring option.
I mean, honestly, like the flamethrower kind of role that Jordan Clarkson has played on this team is something that like is the easiest projection for him. But in terms of just like who he should be, just like he's got the strength and the length to just really be a really, really awesome small ball four who's just, really plays really physical defense, can hit a corner three. Like, I don't even care if he like becomes, I don't believe in his ability to become a dynamic 3-point shooter, but if he could just hit open corner threes, run the occasional pick and roll, attack the occasional closeout, and just make your name as this strong, pesky defender, which I don't know, like a PJ Tucker-ish kind of role, would maybe be my hopeful projection. Again, not the one that I would put for him, kind of like with my Walker Kessler, Brook Lopez. That's not what I think he would become. I just think that might be the actual best version of him that's theoretically possible.
I think I had kind of similar thinking. My comp for him was actually Eric Paschall. I think he's someone that can just kind of be, a physical guy, kind of bully players and who are throwing out a small ball lineup. Someone who can kind of be, a perimeter stopper on the other end of the floor when you need him to be. But that's about what I want him to be. That's kind of the role that I want him to have. I honestly don't want him shooting threes. I think he's a liability on the 3-point line. But maybe someone who can be a screen setter on a pick and roll type thing. Someone you can roll, maybe somebody you can give the ball down to in the post, and you can just let him kind of, beat people down there when they go small. But that's really, I think, the best role for him and probably his best chance of being in the NBA for, years to come.
I actually had a very similar thought to you, Kyler, in terms of what do I think his best role is, and I think it's being a really physical four. I think that's, based on his size, because like he's a thick dude at 230 pounds, and with that massively, just massive wingspan, he should be a much better defender than he is. If he can shoot, then that's even better. But I was almost wondering, the Jazz kind of played Royce O'Neal a lot like that a few seasons ago, where he was kind of like this really physical, kind of undersized four who played really good defense, shot the occasional three. And whenever he was shooting, he had really, really good open looks. And because of the quality of the looks he got, along with, development on his end, Royce O'Neal eventually became like a 40% 3-point shooter. I think that's maybe the ideal role for him, is a 3-and-D guy who's maybe a little bit more D than 3, just because of all of his physical gifts. But that's a long stretch from the type of player he is today. And I think he would be, if that transition ever happens, I don't think it's going to be a quick transition. It would definitely take time for him to accept that role and model his game in the way that he plays both on and off the ball to reflect that type of impact he would have for a team. But we will definitely see what happens. We won't spend too much time on this next guy who was also included in the deal, more maybe as a throw-in than anything else. But the Jazz also received Stanley Johnson in the deal. He's a forward, 6'6", 240 pounds. He was drafted in 2015, and he was drafted in the top 10, and he's still only 26 years old. Last year on a very thin Lakers roster, he played 22 minutes a game, averaging 6.7 points, 3.2 rebounds, 1.7 assists. He only shot 33% from three, 45% from the field. But the big thing on Stanley Johnson is that he's a very capable defender. He was one of the most versatile defenders the Lakers had last year. He guarded everything on the 1 from 5. And even though he's not known as being a great scorer, he has shown flashes. Like, I don't know if you guys remember the Jazz-Lakers game last year where Stanley Johnson went off for 10 points in the fourth quarter against Rudy Gobert. That was a painful quarter to watch. But he's a guy that, even though he's had the bust label put on him before because he was a former top 10 pick who was out of the league for a while, do you think as he's accepted more of this role of playing really strong defense and only scoring when he needs to, could be a guy who breaks the rotation for the Jazz the way that he was able to break the rotation for the Lakers?
I don't. I mean, maybe it's just because I used to have such high hopes for him and he just kept disappointing me that I'm just kind of over him now. But if he plays, it's going to be like when Rudy Gay checked into the game. You're not like, oh yeah, Rudy Gay is in the game, you know. You're just like, oh, Rudy Gay is in, you know, whatever. I don't think he's really much of a needle mover. He can defend. I'd say he's a competent defender more than like a really good one. Just like his size allows him to be versatile, and he just doesn't do anything at that high of a level on the offensive. And so he's just a guy, honestly, if you ask me, in the NBA.
Yeah, he's definitely a guy who doesn't necessarily excel at anything. He's kind of, maybe slightly below average at everything except for defense. I don't think he's part of the Jazz's long-term plans. I imagine they kind of package him and flip him at some point within the next, season or two. I think he's kind of a nice player to have in your back pocket, though, as someone who may not, get a lot of regular rotation minutes, but someone you can throw out again when you need to, just because I do think he does provide some decent versatility with his length and his athleticism. But again, really, I don't think he's going to have a very prominent role in this team going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think there is a role of just like, let's say hypothetically, not like we've ever seen this in real life, a guy like Dillon Brooks is just cooking you in the playoffs, and you can't stop him. He's a guy you can throw out there, right? He's got the length to maybe bother people. I don't think that's someone you can trust to do that night in, night out. But like if you're just having a particularly hard night against someone, just throw him out there, see if he can bother the guy,
Yeah, and that's exactly how I see him and Taylor Horton-Tucker as far as like what they can be in the league and with the Jazz.
Yeah. I don't think either of them maybe have a super strong likelihood at like breaking our 8-man rotation if we have a quote-unquote 8-man rotation this season. But I think they're definitely guys where Taylor Horton-Tucker, at least you have some scoring ability, might be valuable there as a 9th or 10th guy on a roster. And from the opposite end of the spectrum, Stanley Johnson, having a guy who can, at bare minimum, play competent defense against a lot of different players in the league, that's always valuable to have as a guy who, even if he's not playing a ton of minutes, he's a guy you can throw up there for certain matchups. So I'm very lukewarm on having them on the Jazz. I'm glad they're here. I'm glad we have more players who maybe can be competent, and they're both still young enough that they may get better, especially Taylor Horton-Tucker. We'll just have to see what happens down the road.
It's funny that we weren't speaking glowingly about either of them, yet we said we liked the trade for Patrick Beverley, which just shows you what we feel about Patrick Beverley.
We are not the biggest Pat Bev fans, that is for sure. But yeah. But as much as we love the Jazz and their roster, we may have already spoken too much, more than is deserving for Taylor Horton-Tucker and Stanley Johnson. So one last question for both of you before we close out this pod. It has been reported by multiple sources that since the Donovan Mitchell domino has fallen, that the Jazz are now in a fire still, trying to get rid of Mike Conley, Bojan Bogdanovic, and Jordan Clarkson. That's what's been reported. We'll see if it actually happens with any or all three of them. But there's even been reports, I think The Athletic reported that if it's going to happen, there's a high likelihood it's going to happen over the next week or so. If you had to guess which Jazz player out of those three is most likely to be traded in the next week and to which team?
Well, I mean, I think the most likely package is Bojan and one of the two guards. I don't know. I stated previously, like multiple times, that I wanted Jordan Clarkson to stay. Then we got Colin Sexton, who's just kind of plays a very similar role. So, I mean, I still really love Jordan Clarkson, but just having two of the same guy, I don't know. But I think it's Bojan, and I'll just for the sake of this, I'll say Mike, because I think Mike's more beneficial to the Lakers in exchange for picks and the Russell Westbrook, which we would very quickly buy out.
Landon, what do you think?
Yeah, I still think Clarkson's staying. I mean, you saw him hanging out with Ryan Smith at a concert.
Yeah,
I
he
did.
unveiled the new
I met him. We're friends
color
now.
scheme too, and he's been like actually supportive of ingoing and outgoing players like on social media in terms of just who's taken the role of kind of the new face of the Jazz. It's definitely been Jordan Clarkson. So I think that might deter the Jazz a little bit. Not that Danny wouldn't trade him if he felt like he got a good offer, but I think maybe Ryan might want to hold on to it just a little bit.
Yeah. I do think Conley and Bogey are both gone, though. They're probably packaged together. Lakers definitely makes the most sense. I think the Lakers could use Mike Conley more than any other team in the league. There's another team, though, that I think is desperate to just make the playoffs, and I think those two, with who they have, would give them just enough to make the playoffs, or at least get in that playoff contention. That's Sacramento. I can see them moving both those guys to Sacramento for a player, maybe two players, and a couple of picks. That would be my guess.
Yeah, I mean, like maybe Davion Mitchell and a couple picks, and then we get another first guard on the Jazz. But I mean, I don't think that's a terrible idea either. For me personally, I think the one we're most likely to keep is Jordan, both between the jersey unveil, what he's doing for the Jazz culture. And then also I think guys like Jordan Clarkson, I think they're most valuable closer to the trade deadline. So I think that's more likely we'd get the best offer near to the trade deadline than we would now for a guy like Clarkson. But I think that Mike and Bogey are probably gone before the start of the season. I think that the Suns are an interesting team to take a look at just because all the fiasco with DeAndre Ayton, who's coming back, but there's maybe been some issues there. And the fact that they were in the finals 2 years ago and had an underwhelming playoff performance this year, they may be looking to shore up their rotation a little bit more by getting a guy who can score like a Bogey, or maybe even they need another guy who they feel more comfortable with some secondary playmaking and Mike off the bench. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with those two players, but I think Bogey at least makes a lot of sense for Phoenix. So I'd be interesting to see if that deal can go down. But it'll definitely be interesting to see which trades we have to talk more about in the coming days and in the coming weeks. We talked about two today, but before I close, Kyler, it looks like you have something you want to say.
I had one thing that I found interesting on Twitter. I have one trivia question since we have plenty of time in this segment. How many trades have the Jazz made with the Cleveland Cavaliers over the last 5 years?
Oh, man.
Well, we have this one, obviously. Did we
And
get Clarkson from the Cavs?
How did we get
I don't
Clarkson?
know.
Who did we trade for
If it's
Clarkson?
picks for picks, I don't know. Just trades involving players. I don't know if we've done any that just involve picks.
Yeah. Because I thought, man, I'm getting old, but didn't we get Clarkson from the Cavs? So I think there's two. And we had no, because that was part of the Clarkson deal. Huh.
Who did we trade for Clarkson? Was it Rodney Hood?
No, it was
Okay,
that
definitely said Rodney
large man. I feel bad I forgot his name. He was
Dante
at
Exum.
Dante Exum. I was going to describe him as the super tall Australian point guard who never panned out. But
All right, so the answer is 5. We got Kyle Korver from the Cavs. We got Jay Crowder from the Cavs. We got Jordan Clarkson from the Cavs. We gave Rajon Tucker to the Cavs. and then we gave Donovan Mitchell to the Cavs. We've done a trade a year with the Cleveland Cavaliers over the last 5 years. It's kind of nuts.
Dang. I would not have guessed that many. I would have guessed the two that I could think off the top of my head and maybe one more, but
Yeah.
wow, that's a lot of trades with the
We
Cavs.
do a lot of trading with the Cleveland Cavaliers. So just
I
thought
mean,
that was
hey.
an interesting tidbit.
Small market teams got to look out for each other, right?
Yep. I mean, yeah, like you said, there's two small market teams, opposite conferences. They just kind of make sense as trade partners. So
Yeah, it's true. All right. Well, that'll do it for another edition of the Upper Bowl Perspective. We know this isn't dropping on Sunday like we normally do, but we wanted to make sure we got the Donovan Mitchell thoughts to you as quickly as possible. We will be back hopefully next week, assuming that there's stuff to talk about with an all-new episode. But as always, feel free to reach out to us on social media or comment on this YouTube video with anything you want us to talk about. We are always willing to talk about what our fans want to hear. This has been another edition of the Upper Bowl Perspective. Thanks, as always, for listening. Thank you, Donovan, for an amazing 5 years with the Jazz, and we will see y'all next time. Have a good one.
take care, everybody.